Hi, Matt. A good part of this last hour, we've heard from frontline staff and local and regional leaders on what it's looked like to come together as a community in this last year of COVID in response to the needs of our vulnerable neighbors. And now we're asking all of ourselves, what does it look like to come together now going forward? Where are we? How will homeless services look differently? What can we all specifically do? And I'd love to ask your perspective right out of the gate on from a national perspective, what you think has surprised you and perhaps the biggest challenges and opportunities that we're seeing right now in terms of serving those who are vulnerably housed.
Right. It's great to be with you today, Matt, as always. The United States was the only developed democracy that when COVID hit and took this public health crisis to a national scale, we also experienced an eviction crisis. This didn't happen in Paris or Spain or Germany or other parts of the developed world. And it really showed how vulnerable and uniquely troubled our rental market is. And as the economy started going south, renters found themselves in this incredibly vulnerable position, right? So many renters are on the knife edge of eviction already. Most poor renting families spend most of what they have on housing costs before the pandemic. And so the pandemic just exacerbated that. And, one thing that was surprising was government action, right? And so, the moratorium that got rolled out, we estimate that probably prevented 4 million Americans from losing their home during the pandemic. Economists have modeled studies that suggested it decreased the death rate by 11%. And if the moratorium was rolled out in March instead of September, it would have lowered deaths even more. So, next to masking and vaccinations, the eviction moratorium was the most important public health initiative we had during COVID. And then we've seen this giant response from the federal government in terms of rental assistance and really trying to make property owners whole and tenants whole and keep people in their homes. And so I think one of the lasting lessons of COVID from a homelessness and housing perspective was just how deeply troubled the rental market is and how we need to fundamentally change it going forward.
I appreciate you sort of acknowledging the fact that COVID has exacerbated and highlighted something that was already a crisis prior to COVID. But you think about, restaurants cannot stay in business if there are no customers. But we've seen in this last year that owners have effectively been able to stay in business without evictions. What does that observation, outside of government engagement, like you said, what opportunities you think there are there to rethink the way that owners and tenants relate with one another and have a relationship?
Yeah, not only have owners been able to stay in business, but this line that we heard in the media a lot from people that were critical of the moratorium, hey, if tenants don't pay the rent, landlords are going to go in foreclosure. The foreclosure rate today is 78% lower than it was in 2018. There are far fewer foreclosures today than they were before the pandemic. The foreclosure market is so low that people that flip houses are like struggling to make a living. And so it wasn't just an eviction moratorium, it was also a foreclosure moratorium, which we often forget. But the big lesson, and I think the one you're getting at, is, eviction isn't the solution to the rental crisis, and I think that many of us have been so socialized to see eviction as the only option, the thing you reach for as your first option when a tenant doesn't pay. And I think one of the lessons from the pandemic, right, is eviction should be the very last resort, the thing you reach for after every other solution has been tried.
We've heard and talked a lot about the K-shaped recovery, and what we saw from the financial crisis of 2008 is that the impact in the homeless service system didn't really hit until midway through 2010. Is there any projection around what homeless services might look like, or the potential influx of those folks who are on the lower end of the K-shaped recovery might experience after the federal resources are used?
Right. So to put the eviction crisis in a perspective with the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis, there's as many evictions that happen like in a normal American year as foreclosures that happen at the height of the foreclosure crisis.
Well,
So for renters, they're facing like foreclosure crisis levels of displacement every year anyways. And so I think that one thing that was surprising and frankly thrilling is to see the eviction crisis being taken so seriously by many of our elected officials who have frankly ignored housing for the last several years. I think, we have a reconciliation bill that's being debated while you and I are recording this interview, right? And so there's a real chance for Washington to invest in uh, more housing vouchers, more public housing, to fund the Housing Trust Fund more so that more apartments can get built around the country to ease the housing crisis that the country's been in. But I also think that, from a homeless prevention perspective, I also think that there is an opportunity to really rethink eviction court, and as you know from being in eviction courts, that's not a place of justice, like I think that's something that I think a lot of states, red and blue around the country, are learning or relearning through the pandemic.
the biggest revelations I had from Evicted and in our conversations is understanding how, if you're a Black woman, you're 7 times more likely to be evicted than a white woman, all else being equal. If you identify as a brown woman, you're 3 times more likely to be evicted as a white woman. 41% of HomeStart's clients identify as Black, 30% white, 24% brown. And so there's a 50% greater chance of a person who is Black experiencing homelessness than if they were white. And so would love just to pause to have you kind of reflect a bit about what we're talking about as a racial justice issue.
Right. There's so much to say in response to that, question. One of the ways that I've come to think of it is, one way to tell the story of African American history in America is the systematic dispossession of Black families from the land, the soil of the United States. So you go from slavery to sharecropping to the Great Migration, where Black families were corralled into ghettos they literally didn't own. In the 1930s, about 99% of Black families in Milwaukee, for example, were renters. And the landlords in those areas had no incentive to fix up their building. They could charge Black folks more than white folks in other parts of the country. You finally have the end of legal housing segregation in the late 1960s, and it only came because Martin Luther King was murdered on a Memphis balcony, and that caused unrest that pushed Congress to finally act on housing in ways they wouldn't before. But that just caused white flight. It caused disinvestment from the cities. You run that up to the Great Recession, where we know that Black and brown homes were targeted by predatory lending. And most Black businesses during the Great Recession went under and didn't recover. And then you run it up to today, and you find that evictions are concentrated in areas that are predominantly African American, and that's especially acute now in the health crisis. The areas that have the highest risk of eviction have the lowest vaccination rates in the country, and so we've created this semi-permanent renter class in the United States. Most Black families are renters, most Latino families are renters, and most white families, because we've had a very different history, are homeowners and are benefiting from all the wealth and tax benefits that come with home ownership. One of the biggest reasons folks can own their home is because their parents refinance their own home to help with their down payment. And so just in that simple transaction is history, right? And privilege. And so I think that has to be part of the conversation. If we care about racial inequality, we have to care about things like eviction and the housing crisis. The story is just deepened and accentuated in COVID because a lot of people that were forced to go to work and were called essential workers were Latino and African Americans that were in the service industry or in jobs that they didn't have a lot of flex to work at home. So not only you're exposed to the pandemic, you're also exposed disproportionately to the housing crisis. So from a racial justice standpoint, it's not just a matter of it's not just a story about poverty, and it's not just a story about even a story of unfairness or injustice. It's a deep, deep story about the racial fissures in the country and how they still matter today. You know, Black folks are twice as likely to get evicted in this country as white folks among renters, and so yeah, I mean, the questions you raise are kind of the story behind this crisis.
Mm. Yeah, building off of that, this morning I was talking with a person who felt very disconnected and was basically saying, how do I welcome my neighbor? How do I welcome folks who are suffering? And you know, something that we talked about is that in your travels over the last number of years nationally, that was a question that you got asked a lot. Like, is this my fault?
Right.
And I'd love your reflection a bit on, you know, how do we welcome our neighbors? Is this our fault, even if we feel relatively removed from individuals whose housing is very unstable and people who are in crises?
Yeah, I think that if we're all going to claim a part of the tradition and the history of the nation, we have to claim all of it. So if we're going to think of ourselves as an independent people, a people that fought Britain, a people that endorsed a free enterprise, built something out of nothing in this new country, if we are, you know, the people that fought World War II, we are also the people that, you know, enslaved Black families. We are also the people that fought tooth and nail to uphold Jim Crow. We are also the people that, you know, displaced hundreds of thousands of Mexican arrivals in the early part of the 20th century. And so I think we have to have all of that. We are all of that. And so I do think that we're implicated in this somehow. You know, 1 in 5 kids don't have enough to, like, they live in homes that they don't have enough to buy basic necessities in this country. 1 in 5. That's like, we call it poverty. It's like this abstract term, but it literally means you don't have enough to eat. You can't pay the lights. You can't pay the rent. And the way we talk about that, regardless of our politics, often is like it's no one's fault, right? Like the jobs just left, or you know, or people didn't work hard enough, or they made bad decisions, and those let us off the hook. And I think we know deep down that's wrong. You know, I think we know deep down that that's not the case. You know, and so in housing, there's a very clear example. I mean, you know, we spend about $150 billion every year on homeowner tax benefits. Most of that money goes to families with six-figure incomes. Most of that money goes to white families because of the homeownership disparities. That number, like, far, far, far outpaces direct housing assistance to the needy, right? If you added up all the money we spend on public housing, Section 8, homeless prevention, it would look like this, and homeowner subsidies would look like this. Mm-hmm. It's hard to think of a policy that does a better job of replicating and exacerbating our racial and economic inequality. So, you know, if that's going to be our creed in this country, we at least have to own up to it and stop repeating this idea that the richest country on the planet can't afford to do more. So I think that but that's abstract also. But there are things like in one's personal life, right, where we can take a hard look at that. So I think there are a lot of families out there that would be happy to donate money to an organization like HomeStart for homeless prevention, but would not be happy if a homeless shelter got built in their neighborhood, or an affordable housing unit got built in their neighborhood. And that's something I think we have to take a real hard moral look at. You know, we can't fix poverty without sharing. And I think that a lot of the housing crisis around the country, it is not caused by a lack of resources. It's caused by a lack of willingness of folks, like white folks with means, to saying, yeah, I want this in my community. I want my community to be a welcoming, diverse economic community. I want families of all income backgrounds to go to the same school that my kids go to. And until we kind of are able to kind of stake our moral claim on those kind of claims, I think we have to admit our implication in this kind of problem.
There are about a half a dozen zings in your reaction to that that I think are healthy for all of us to reflect on. And just as we wrap up, if a person who's watching this has any question around what they specifically can do to move the needle with respect to relieving some pain, that I would love to have an anonymous and or non-judgmental conversation to explore some of that. And so those of you who are watching this conversation, if you have any interest in asking some of those questions, I would invite you to please reach out to me. It's my last name, Pritchard, Pritchard, at homestart.org. I'd love, I'd welcome, I'd be encouraged by a conversation as we explore these very human questions and what we can do. We can't solve poverty without sharing. And Matthew, I've got to tell you that, your work that you've done for the first time for a lot of people has made personal, and folks have empathized and identified with folks who are struggling in a way that they hadn't before. And so I want to thank you for all of your work, all of your advocacy. And so would want to open this last comment up to anything that you feel like would be worth sharing just as we wrap up our conversation.
I want to thank you, Matt. HomeStart has been an inspiration to me throughout the years. It's been clear evidence that, intervening in, the violence of eviction, this thing that invites not only homelessness. I mean, eviction just doesn't make families homeless. It can really cast people on this harder road in life, right? Kids have to switch schools. You lose your neighborhood. Often workers lose their jobs. Studies have linked eviction to high rates of depression, suicide. Pregnant women who get evicted, their babies are born with health problems, which means eviction can have like generational effects, right? And so I think this idea of an early intervention that just is humane, is low touch and high return. It's so hopeful, and I think that this is a moment. This is a crisis we shouldn't waste. Right? This is a crisis where we should say, normal was broken to begin with. We do not want to go back to normal. And so I think that thinking about innovative ways to take models like HomeStart and make it, frankly, these models can't just exist in rich liberal cities like Boston. Mm-hmm. And so making it something that the country adopts and takes up gives me hope, and can't thank you and your team enough for all your work.
Thanks. It is a team effort. Thank you so much, Matt, again for your work and for being with us today.
Yep. Thanks, Matt.